right. Well, what I'm going to do is pull up the, what we're going to, Lord willing, do together this morning is I would like to just cover the second assignment for your Proverbs passage. Let me get everything set up here. All right, that's good. Okay. Because there are some similarities to, we did almost the same assignment you did for Psalms, your Psalm. There are a few differences, though, that I want to point out just to make sure you're clear. Now, I've already sent I posted a copy of this on Canvas that you can download. I also sent it out by Facebook message a little earlier today, so you can have that with you. But if you haven't yet completed this assignment, and most of you haven't, so go ahead and follow this format. If you've already done this assignment, you don't need to redo it, but if you would like to redo it using this updated format, that would be great. All right. So what I wanted to do today was just go over this assignment with you. I'm going to use one example from Proverbs chapter 1. And just then if there are any questions about this particular assignment, or if you have a question about your passage for this assignment or the last assignment, background context, literary context, then you can go ahead and ask that as well today. Okay, so that's going to be, Lord willing, our focus, so I can get you as prepared as I can to complete this assignment. All right, and so I just want to encourage you, try to keep ahead here. Don't let yourself get too far behind. I think all of you guys have preached your first passage sermon, so that's great. So you're at the place you need to be. Just don't let this Proverbs passage, don't get too far behind on it. All right. So we're still in good shape as far as that goes, since we're early on in this second passage. But just want to encourage you, give a couple hours each week, and you should be able to stay on task and be on where we need to be. Let me just make a few introductory remarks, and then we'll go through this this particular assignment. Remember, Proverbs we're treating a little differently than we did the Psalms. We're going to do a lot of things the same because it's poetry, but also too, Proverbs is wisdom literature, and the book of Proverbs was written as a book. There is one primary author, and he had a particular purpose in writing the book. He has a specific audience, a specific goal that he's trying to accomplish. Now, he's going to cover many topics, specific topics in the book, but the general thrust and overall purpose and what his goal is the same for the whole book. All right. So there's an overall goal that the author wants to accomplish, and he mentions that goal in the first few verses. And then, of course, to accomplish that goal, he addresses a number of different topics throughout the book. And in fact, the book of Proverbs is structured in such a way that there's a few different, it's got an interesting, unique structure. In fact, I'm going to pull that up. Let me see. Did I give that to you? Give me a minute here to look. Yeah, no. Did I do it? Okay, that's not it. Is it here? I think it's here. Let me just remind you of the structure of Proverbs because it has, okay, here we go. This is what I wanted to show you. If I can get to it. There we go. Okay. Sorry for that delay. All right. Now, what I have here is just the structure of Proverbs, and it's an interesting book because it's a mixture of how he approached presenting the various topics. Now, Solomon, of course, being the primary author of the book, and the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are written with what I call extended poems, because each of these poems are 1 chapter long. So Proverbs 2 is 1 poem. Proverbs 3 is 1 poem. Proverbs 4, 1 poem. Each of those poems have a specific theme and topic and focus, and they're all written in a particular flow. They give a particular flow of thought. That's why for your background, your literary context, I wanted you to summarize each of those chapters and their main theme, because I want you to be thinking about how those first 9 chapters connect together. And so what Solomon does is he writes these extended poems. They aren't psalms. They're not structured exactly like a psalm, because remember, a psalm often has a heading, and then it has its own. Each of the psalms has their own occasion and setting and focus and purpose. But Proverbs 1 to 9 are all connected together. They together have a particular focus and purpose, and then each of those chapters look at some different aspect to develop the overall focus. And so what I'm going to have you do in this assignment today is I want you to look at the chapter as a whole in which your passage is found. And I'll explain that in a minute. Because Proverbs 1 to 9 are these chapter-long poems that Solomon has placed together in a particular order to communicate a particular message. And then what he does in chapters 10 through 22, Solomon arranges a bunch of those short statements, which, again, we call those, if you remember the word, aphorism. Again, an aphorism is a short, 1 or 2 verse long statement or wisdom statement. And so Proverbs 10 through 22 are a number of these statements that Solomon arranged. So the format is different than chapters 1 through 9. 1 through 9 are extended poems. 10 through 22 are Solomon's short aphorisms that he compiled, and they're not necessarily in any particular order. You'll have maybe, if we look at, for example, we'll just pick out a few. If we look at Proverbs here, let's go to chapter 10. And here, if we look at just starting in chapter 10, verse 1, notice, by the way, there's a structural marker here. After chapter 9 ends, again, chapter 9 is the final extended poem, the 9th extended poem in the beginning of Proverbs. Then notice this first verse in chapter 10. It says the Proverbs of Solomon. So this is where he shifts from these extended poems to these short statements, these aphorisms. And notice they don't seem to have a particular order. A wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. Okay, talking about, being the wise versus foolish son. And then verse 2, ill-gotten gains do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Okay, well, how does verse 2 connect to verse 1? It doesn't. It's a different topic. Verse 3, the Lord will not allow the righteous to hunger, but he will reject the craving of the wicked. Verse 4, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. So do you see, each of those first 4 verses deals with a totally different topic. Now, generally speaking, it's talking about the wise or the righteous versus the fool or the unrighteous. But the exact topics are different, and it's that way all the way through. Now, sometimes, for example, I think it's Proverbs 17, you might get a number of statements around a similar concept, like verse 1 speaks of quietness. Verse 7, excellent speech. Verse 10, a rebuke. Verse 14, talking about quarreling. So in this chapter, there are several verses aphorisms that address communication, but it's not a chapter on communication. They're just sort of sprinkled around. And so chapters 10 to 22 are these short statements by Solomon that he arranged that don't seem to have a particular order. They just all are under the umbrella of the wise or the fool, the wicked or the righteous. Okay, and then what happens in chapter 22, in the middle of chapter 22, there we see this reference to hear the words of the wise. And then again in chapter 24, we see that statement, these are the sayings of the wise. Okay, now still in these chapters, they're all aphorisms. They're all short statements. Okay, I believe they are also written by Solomon. Some try to argue that the wise, the reference there to the wise here means it's somebody else. The sayings of the wise, it's some other person. But I think it's just, I still think it's Solomon who is making these statements. So I would see chapters 10 through 24 as essentially a collection of aphorisms by Solomon. Okay, now then in chapter 25, what's interesting is there are more Proverbs of Solomon that apparently Solomon did not include, or we're not quite sure, but here we see it mentions that these are Proverbs of Solomon, which are to follow, but they were transcribed by the men of Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah comes many generations later after Solomon. But apparently, there were still a number of these aphorisms that had been recognized as written by Solomon, inspired wisdom statements by Solomon, that were then compiled by Hezekiah maybe 200 or so years later. Okay? And so, but this is still, chapters 25 through 29 are still these aphorisms by Solomon. So essentially, we have this. We have chapters 1 to 9, extended poems by Solomon, all right, that are linked together to express a particular thought, a particular theme. And then you have chapters 10 through 29, which are Proverbs by Solomon, but they're the short aphorisms by Solomon, some of which Solomon arranged and some of which men in Hezekiah's day arranged, but still all authored by Solomon. Then we have in chapter 30, there appears to be another author, the words of Agur, son of Jakeh, the oracle. Now, there's many arguments as to this could be Solomon writing under a pseudonym, and we're not quite sure. I think it could be another individual who God used to communicate some wisdom. And his approach was, I believe this chapter is, again, one chapter with a particular purpose that he focuses on a few key thoughts. They're 4, 5, 6 verses long, stanzas that are written by Agur. And then, of course, Proverbs 31 is the words of King Lemuel, which again, some believe might be another reference to Solomon. But actually, these words were not Lemuel's fully. They came from his mother. So if anyone ever asks, Do we know if there's any scripture that's authored by a woman? Here's one example, Proverbs 31. And not just verses 10 and following, but the whole chapter. Okay? They're the words of King Lemuel's mother, which King Lemuel then put to writing. All right? I tend to think it might be Solomon, but I don't want to get into a whole discussion on that here. Okay, so the whole book of Proverbs still has, even if Agur and Lemuel are different authors, it still falls under the same purpose that Solomon had for the book. Okay, as articulated in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, I believe. Okay, so now I'm going over this structure again because I want you, every passage that you have been assigned from chapters 1 through 9. Okay, so that's not what I wanted. Where is it? Sorry, there it is. Okay. So all of you have been assigned a passage from this first section of Proverbs, the extended poems. Okay, so they're not like a psalm because these poems are not isolated. They're not independent. They connect together, but they are a poem that has a particular focus, kind of like a narrative, where in a narrative you'll have a collection of stories that are connected together, but each of those stories also has a particular focus and theme, as you guys saw when you taught through narratives. In a similar way, I think Proverbs 1 through 9 act like that. And so when you analyze, I gave each of you a passage from these first 9 chapters, but I didn't give you the whole chapter. See, so I was being very kind to you, all right? I just gave you a part of each chapter, all right? But still, you'll need to understand the focus of the whole chapter, how your part fits into that chapter, okay? It's not a separate poem. It's one of the stanzas within the larger poem. Now, you don't need to preach the whole poem, but you do need to understand it, and I'll show you that in a moment. Okay? So that's the focus then. You're going to treat the study of your particular Proverbs passage similarly as you did with your Psalms passage, except I want you to recognize your passage is not independent. It's not independent from the chapter that it is in. You need to understand the whole chapter, and it's not independent from those first 9 chapters. It's connected, all right? Unlike the Psalms, which are all separate. They're all independent. Okay? Are there any questions on the structure, anything that I've been describing so far? Okay. That means I must be very clear. I must be an excellent teacher. So there's no questions. Or you guys are just very nice. Okay. But I did want to at least make sure and check. Now, as we consider, let's go back to the format for your second assignment then with that information. Okay. So here we go. This is assignment number 2. Okay. Maybe I should put that at the top here. And hopefully here I'll expand it a little more so you guys can see it a little better, hopefully. Okay. So this is the document that I sent you guys. All right. Today. And this document's an example for the setting and structure analysis. So again, assignment 1 was the background and literary context for the book of Proverbs. Assignment number 2, you're now going to focus and do the poetic analysis for your passage. Okay, some of you have Proverbs 2, 1 through 8. Some of you have Proverbs 3, 13 to 18. Some of you have Proverbs 4, 20 to 27, I think. You might have Proverbs 6, 6 to. So I gave you 5 or 6 verses from somewhere in Proverbs chapter 1 through 9. All right. So each of you have that passage. What I'm going to do is show you an example from Proverbs 1, 10 to 19 in this particular example, in this assignment. Okay. So this is the first step of the poetic analysis, where we focus on the passage. And again, I put references to page numbers in the teacher's manual for module 3, so you can reference that. And then we recorded back session 2, recorded that, and there's some discussion about the setting and structure of a poem that you can get there as well. Okay. And then, of course, the notes for those first 2 sessions will be helpful. Okay, so these are the steps that I want you to complete for this assignment. The first step is read and observe. Okay, so read through the poem several times. Now, again, notice what I highlighted here. For a passage from Proverbs 1 through 9 or 30 or 31, read the entire chapter. Okay. Nobody here has a passage from 30 or 31, but all of you have a passage from Proverbs 1 through 9. So read the whole chapter, because your passage fits within the chapter. Okay. Again, every chapter is an extended poem. And so your section fits within that. So for example, I have Proverbs 1, in this example, 10 through 19. So let's say these are the verses that I'm going to preach. This is my passage, but it's contained within an extended poem. And technically in chapter 1, that poem begins in verse 8 through verse 33. So here we have, this actually is the full poem, verses 8 through 33. All right. I'm just going to be focusing on, in my passage, 10 through 19. You have the same thing. Some of you may have Proverbs 2, 1 through 8. That's just part of the whole poem of Proverbs 2. Some of you have Proverbs 3, 19 to 26, I think. That's just a part of the whole poem from Proverbs 3. Okay, so when I say read and observe, you're going to read the whole chapter. You don't have to read all 9 chapters. Just read the chapter your passage is in. So if your passage is Proverbs 4, 20 to 27, you're going to read chapter 4. If your passage is Proverbs 3, 1 to 6, you're going to read Proverbs 3. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So read the entire chapter. Again, since each poem is from this section is a chapter in length. All right, so just like before, you're going to read through several times, get familiar with the chapter, then make observations. The next step in this assignment then is to identify the setting. Now, this one will be easy because essentially you've already done this in the first assignment. Okay? So really what you're going to be doing is you're giving the background context of the poem. Now, for a psalm, you would be focusing on the background of that psalm. But in this case, for these Proverbs passages, the background context is the background context of the book. All right. Author, recipients, when it was written. So that work you actually already did. Okay. So all you're going to have to do is go back to your first assignment and just put in some information here. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Okay, so that step should be easy. The first step is easy also. It's reading and reading and reading and then making observations. The third step is where you're going to need to do a little bit of work. Okay, for this assignment, that's where you're going to spend most of your time on this. Identify the type and structure of the poem. Okay, what type of poem is it? Now that's going to be easy to answer. Every passage in Proverbs is a wisdom poem. Okay, there's your answer. Okay, this is a wisdom literature. So in the Psalms, we had different types, right? We had laments, we had praise and thanksgiving, we had enthronement psalms, We had messianic psalms, and then we also had wisdom psalms in the book of Psalms. Here in Proverbs, every poem is a wisdom poem. Okay? So that question is going to be easy to answer. But the next part, that's where you're going to need to do some work. Identify the stanzas within the poem. Now, what that means is you're going to have to identify the stanzas for the entire chapter where your passage is found. Okay? So again, if you have Proverbs 2, verses 1 to 8, you're going to need to identify all the stanzas in Proverbs chapter 2. Okay? If your passage is Proverbs 6, 6 through 11, you're going to need to identify all the stanzas in chapter 6. Okay? Just your chapter, but identify each stanza, because your passage is part of that extended poem. Okay? I'll show you an example of this in a moment. All right, so those are the 3 steps for this assignment number 2. Read through the chapter several times and make observations. Identify the setting of your chapter, which again is the setting of the book. So that should be straightforward. Then identify the type and structure of your poem. And again, remember, you're looking at the whole chapter. So you need to identify the structure of the chapter, each stanza in the chapter. Okay? So let me just do this for Proverbs 1, 10 to 19. All right? Now, Proverbs 1 is a little different because verses 1 to 7 really are the introduction to the book. And so those aren't part of the first poem. The first poem begins here in verse 8. Okay, so these verses are really the poem, part of the poem. So maybe I can, I'll just do this, maybe italicize them. Okay. So for me, if I'm studying verses 10 to 19, I'm looking at actually verses 8 through 33. That's the whole poem. Okay. And like I said, verses 1 through 7 are the introduction to the book. So they really aren't part of this first poem. But Proverbs chapter 2, the whole chapter is a poem. Proverbs 3, the whole chapter is a poem with a specific theme. Proverbs 4, etc. Okay? Now, so if I'm looking at this assignment, the first step is to read and observe. So again, what I'm going to do is, because my passage is chapter 1, verses 10 to 19, I'm going to read through all of chapter 1, particularly verses 8 to 33, and just read through that over and over and over. And so just what I want you to do in your assignment, just note how many times you read your chapter. And then again, my encouragement to you is to read it in different translations as well. Okay? Including your Cebuano translation would be fine. So read it several times. So I indicated here, I read Proverbs 1 14 times using 4 different translations. And then I wrote down all my general observations. And I'd like you to at least have a minimum of 15 observations. Okay? Now, these observations, remember, are not just you summarizing each verse, all right? Don't do that. The observations are simply just things that you notice. Maybe you see things that are repeated. A couple of times here, I noticed repetition in my passage. And again, this is in the whole chapter, not just your verses, but the whole chapter. So I noticed the repetition of the reference to his son. He repeats the words counsel, reproof. He repeats these synonyms, dread and calamity. So I noticed some repetition. I asked a few questions. I said, verse 8, is the son reference to just one of his sons, or is he speaking generally to all of his children? Another question in verse 20, the answer to how to avoid the wicked. Is this verse an answer to what he said in verses 8 to 19? All right. I just make general observations. I noticed 1 Kings 4:32 tells us how many Proverbs Solomon wrote. Because he's the author, verse 1. Okay, so simply just make some observations and make at least 15 observations from the whole chapter. Okay? That's your first step. Just read the chapter several times. Make at least 15 observations and include in your observations some questions that you have about the passage. And it doesn't have to be just from your verses. Again, it can be anywhere from the chapter. Okay, any part of the poem that you have. It doesn't just have to be the verses you've been assigned. The verses you have been assigned are the verses you will preach. But in order to preach those verses, you need to understand the whole poem that they are found in, okay? Because they will be connected to it. So, in this first step, as you read and observe, do that for the whole chapter, okay? Questions? We're good?
Pastor Tim.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning, Pastor Tim. I noticed that you mentioned there or indicated there First Kings 4 verse 32.
Yes.
Will that fall under the general observation in the context of the chapter itself, or shall that belong to other parts of the assignment?
Observations are, you know what, when you read something in scripture, sometimes things come to your mind from other passages, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's what happened to me here. As I was reading verse 1, it said, that the Proverbs written by Solomon, I remember, I remember a verse that talked about how many Proverbs he wrote. So that's just something that came to my mind. It doesn't have to be a key insight that you're going to preach. All right. This is just whatever comes in your mind. You're just interacting with what you're reading in this chapter. So sometimes another verse might come to mind, or you might read something and think, this sounds a lot like what was said in Psalm 27. I wonder, is there some intentional connection? But so the idea that First Kings came to my mind when I was reading verse 1. So that's why I put it down. It's an observation.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be, sometimes your observations may not be directly from the passage, but the passage might trigger your mind or might cause you to think of something else. And so that's a legitimate observation. Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
I observed your observation with your text from verse 10 to 19, but most of your observation outside of your passage.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I only spent about 20 minutes on this. So just because I'm just showing this to you by way of an example. So normally, I would have more observations. Usually I'll have 30 or 40 observations from a chapter. So so you made a good observation in noticing that I didn't put anything between verses 10 to 19, but I did have a couple things. Noticed here the repetition of son. I did mention that. I did refer to verses 8 to 19, and how verse 20 seems to be connected to it. So there are some references to it. But yeah, normally I would have a lot more observations listed. I'm just showing this to you by way of an example. But it does show that not all of your observations need to be from your specific verses. I want you to be familiar with the whole chapter. Okay? But good observation there, actually. Any other questions or comments on this part, on read and observe? Hopefully by now, how to do this, you're familiar with it, all right? Because this is a key step that I'm always encouraging you to do, is just reading and getting familiar with the passage, okay? Make observations. All right. The second step, identify the setting. That is, what is the background context of this poem? What is the occasion, purpose of the poem? Now, again, as I said, because of this is in Proverbs, let me do this. Because this is in Proverbs, in those first 9 chapters, then really the background context is the same for every one of those chapters. Okay, same author, same recipients, same overall purpose. Okay, so really what you're just going to do is look to your first assignment and essentially just give a sort of a summary of what you found in your first assignment. So that's what I did here. I have normally a title. I just made mention, if you're studying a psalm, often you'll have a title with some information, but this is not a psalm, so there's no title. Then mention the author, the recipients. The author mentions some specific recipients and the general audience. When it was written, since we know the author, we can identify the time period in which he wrote. Of course, it's Solomon, and he probably wrote it earlier in his reign because later in his reign as king, he turned away from the Lord. The geography. Now, Proverbs is interesting. There's really not that many places mentioned, but there are some references to a few places, and you can look at them here when you study this example. People mentioned. Now, specific names aren't mentioned, but he does mention the grouped categories of people, right? Naive, the fool, and the wise. We could also add others, but here, what I want you to do is just focus on, in these particular points, just focus these two on your chapter. Are there any places mentioned in your chapter? Any people mentioned in your chapter? Okay. Now I went ahead and I did places mentioned in my chapter, but then also places mentioned in the book. Okay. And then the occasion, again, I mentioned there, that's the occasion for the book. Okay. Because again, each of these extended poems fit into the purpose of the book. They're not like Psalms. Solomon didn't just write one on a particular day with a specific background and purpose, and then another one at another time with a different purpose. They're all connected. They're all linked together. Same overall purpose and occasion. Okay? So step 2 should be pretty easy for you. You're just going to bring in a lot of assignment number 1 with you, but then for geography and people, you're going to want to focus attention on your chapter. All right? Any questions on that? Hopefully that's straightforward. Okay. So again, these first 2 steps, the read and observe and the identify setting, those are straightforward, hopefully. Shouldn't take you more than probably 30, or well, I guess reading several times. Those first 2 steps should not take you more than an hour to do, probably less. And then in the 3rd step, identifying the type and the structure. Identifying the type won't take you long at all because again, it's all the same. It's a wisdom poem. Okay. I noted several psalms here that I wrote down that were wisdom psalms, just for reference. You don't have to do that, but I chose to. Now, most of the effort, the bulk of your effort on this particular assignment is going to come when you're looking at the structure. Now, we already talked a little bit about this in the literary context step last week, but here what you're going to do is focus on your chapter. Okay? You don't have to focus on chapters 1 through 9. Just focus on the chapter where your passage is. Because what we want to do now is you will need to see, how does your passage fit in the chapter as a whole? Because again, the whole chapter is the poem, and your section is just a part of the poem. And so what we need to do is understand, what is the structure of the whole poem in your chapter? All right, so the first step you're going to want to do is compare the translations. How do the translations break up the stanzas. So as I showed you last week, but we'll just look at it again, just by way of review. If I look here at, let's go to Proverbs 1, okay, and just see again, basically all the translations will indicate each stanza by a space between stanzas, okay? So, for example, in chapter 1, this is the New American Standard Translation. They have a space between verses 6 and 7. So they're saying verses 1 to 6 are sort of one stanza. And verse 7, notice, there's a space between verse 7 and 8. So they isolate verse 7 as its own stanza. And then, starting in verse 8, all the way to verse 19, they have as one stanza. There's a space between 19 and 20. And then verse 20 all the way to 33 is the next stanza. So they have two large stanzas here. Let's see what the ESV does for chapter 1. Okay, so if we go back, ESV has, notice, just look for the space between verse 6 and 7. So the first stanza is 1 to 6. Space between 7 and 8. The second stanza is verse 7. And then they have verses 8 through 19. And then a space. And then verses 20 to 33. Just like the New American Standard. Okay. Let's look at one more. New King James. Let's see, how do they break it up? They have verses 1 through 6, and then a space. Verse 7, then a space. And then they break up verses 8 and 9. Notice there's a space between 9 and 10. And then 10 through 19, and the space. And then notice between verses 27 and 28, they have a space. And then 28 to 33. So if we go back to, I just looked at several English translations to see how they came up with what they came up with. And here you'll notice that okay. Notice from these 6 translations, I just summarized, because what I'm looking for is there a pattern? Because if there's agreement among several translations, then that's a good indication of, a good place to start in looking at the structure of the poem. So that's all I'm doing here. And I noticed a lot of them do have very similar structure. The New American Standard matches with the ESV, and it matches the Holman translation. All right. And it's pretty close to the Net Bible, not exactly the same. Now, the New King James and the NIV split it up a little more. Okay. So that sort of gives me a starting point. But I don't want to stop there, okay? Because again, remember, these translations, that's just their interpretation. There's nothing in the original Hebrew text that identifies stanzas, okay? So this is just what they think after translating these particular passages, this particular chapter, all right? That's their opinion. So, they have a good understanding of the chapter, so I want to take that into consideration. But then, secondly, after I look at the translations, I want to look, are there any structural markers in the passage? Particularly, is there a statement repeated? Is there an inclusio? Is there Salah? Now, in the Proverbs, there's no Salah. That's only in Psalms that we find that. But notice here, if I go to my passage, I noticed something in verse 8. Notice it says, "Hear, my son." And then verse 10, "My son." And then verse 15, "My son." Now, usually, Solomon, as I looked at other chapters, he just has "my son" at the beginning of the chapter. But in this particular poem, he repeats that. And I think he's using that as a marker between each of the stanzas. Okay? And he's giving a different instruction in each of those. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean every time you see my son in that it has to be a marker, but I think he's using it in that way. All right? Because here he talks about how the sinners tempt him in verses 10 through 14. And then in verse 15, he says, don't walk their way because this is what they do. So verses 10 to 13, this is what they say. Verses 15 to 18 or 19, this is what they do. So I could see some, I think, different focus in each of those. That's why I believe they are stanzas separated, identified by this reference to my son. Okay? So that's one thing to look for, is are there any markers, any refrain, repeated word or phrase that seems to separate, or an inclusio. Okay? Then what I want to look for, is there any change in speaker, in tone, in the grammar, in the subject matter? And again, you can go back to session 1, and we go into all of this stuff in detail. Here I'm just summarizing it. And notice what I noticed in this psalm is verse 20. It goes from Solomon speaking to his son directly to him describing wisdom as almost as a person. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. And she utters her sayings. So there's a shift. Verses 8 through 19, Solomon speaking directly to his son. My son, listen to me. My son, don't listen to sinners. My son, don't walk in the way of sinners. But then verse 20, there's a shift, and he talks about wisdom. Wisdom is speaking now. Okay? So to me, that's a significant shift or change. And then within verses 20 through 33, I see a shift in how wisdom speaks. In verses 20 to 27, wisdom speaks directly and saying, you. Notice, how long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? Turn, that's again referencing you. You turn to my reproof. I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I called and you refused. So there's that you pronoun. That focus is wisdom speaking directly to the naive and the foolish. But then in verse 28, notice it says, wisdom still speaking, but says, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me, but they will not find me. They hated knowledge. Do you see that? There's a shift from wisdom speaking directly, saying you. Now, in verse 28 to 33, it's they, or he who listens to me shall live. Okay? So it moves from wisdom speaking in the second person to wisdom speaking to the fools in the third person. Okay, that's one thing you should look for if you're trying to look for differences that might indicate different stanzas. Okay? Verses 20 to 27, the focus is on wisdom speaking directly to the fool and naive in the second person. Verses 28 to 33 in the third person. So my opinion is, I think this stanza 20 to 33 should be broken up into two stanzas. And so this is what I came up with for my passage. Taking into account the structural markers, taking into account the change in this case, grammar, and considering, I haven't really changed anything here except that, for example, I just broke up some of the stanzas, but the New King James actually follows what my thoughts were almost. They're pretty close. So here's what I came up with for my passage, for my chapter. Okay, the introduction is 1 through 7. And verses 8 to 33 are my psalm. And based on those things I just described to you, the structural markers, that change in grammar, this is how I broke up the poem into 5 stanzas. And notice my passage is verses 10 to 19. So I have 2 stanzas out of the 5. So if I was preaching this passage, I would give the theme for all 5 stanzas, the whole poem, but then I would say, let's turn our attention to the second and third stanzas, and then the sermon would be focused on that. All right, so this is going to be a little bit different than what you did for the Psalms, because for the Psalms, you preached the whole psalm, except some of you had Psalm 119. So those of you that had Psalm 119, you'll be used to this, all right? But many of you had entire psalms that you preached. But here, you're going to have a piece of the poem. So you're going to need to figure out, how do I preach just that piece, but in the context of the poem overall? Okay? And so this will help you do that. What I'm wanting you to do is see, how does your passage fit in the whole poem? Okay? Now, when you preach the sermon, you can choose to preach on the theme of the poem and then just focus attention on the verses that you have been assigned, okay? All right. And like I said, this will take up most of your time. So as you examine the chapter, look for these things. Start with the translations and what they say, but then go back and examine on your own and ask yourself, now do I see any structural markers to consider, or any change in the tone or the grammar, the speaker, things like that? All right. And again, you can go back to chapter 1. You can go back to, I think I said, yeah, you can go back to pages 32 and 33 in the teacher's manual for module 3, and you can get more information there on this particular step. Okay. But give time to this step, because it's an important one as you're examining the structure of the poem. That'll help you get the context for the whole poem. Okay? All right. That's assignment 2. First, are there any questions for this assignment in general? Does everything make sense, I hope? My guess is this assignment will probably take you at most a couple hours, maybe a little less, but I think you can get it done in a couple of hours. And so this assignment I have is due, toward the end of the week, or I'm sorry, I think Monday or Tuesday of next week. Okay, if there's no general questions, does anyone have a specific question on their passage in relation to this assignment? Or a question in relation to the last assignment on the background and literary context?
Yes, Pastor Tim. How can it's hard for me to identify the cultural context.
Okay, of the book?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, let's look at the key. All right, here's Proverbs. Let's go to the New American Standard. Let me do this. Make it a little bigger. Okay. All right, so the first 7 verses are really important for understanding the background context of Proverbs. And something that we learn right at the beginning is who the author is, right? Solomon. And we know it's King Solomon, the son of David, because he says. So this tells us the time period for when this was written. All right. It's written by an Israelite king. It's written to, we would presume generally those who are naive or the youth, as well as his sons. Okay, right? Because that's what he says in verse 8. Hear my son. So there's a general audience, the naive and the youth, the young. There's a specific audience in his sons, and they would fall under the category of the youth. So what you'd want to think about is just what was the culture of Israel at that time? In other words, right, this is an ancient Near Eastern culture, around 900 BC. They were primarily, agricultural culture. And as far as a lot of them were farmers. They didn't live in big cities. But you're looking at a man who's a king. He's the wisest man who ever lived, and he's speaking to his sons primarily here. So culture is just kind of identifying what this people group is like. Okay, you don't have to have a lot of information. You don't have to put down a lot of information for that, but mainly I just want you to know, to identify, okay, these are the Israelites living in around the 900 BC, right after King David. They've lived under a good king. They're united as a country at this point in time. Are the people generally following God or not? What do we know from the book of Kings? Early in Solomon's reign, is the culture generally being obedient or rebellious? I mean, those are the kinds of things you're looking for.
Okay, thank you,
Pastor
Pastor.
Tim,
Yeah, Ruel?
uh, but at this stage of our preparation for the assignment, we should limit only our references in finding the cultural background to the scripture. We're
Yes.
not yet allowed to look into some other resources.
Yeah, just focus on that, on this, what you find in the scripture. Okay. I mean, sometimes you'll know things that you've read before, and that's okay. Like I know Solomon reigned, from like around 900 BC. Now that's not in the Bible, but I remember that from other studies. So I think I even put that in my on my assignment, and I didn't reference. Yeah, I put it under author, or under when written. I said Solomon reigned from 970 to 930 BC. Now, that's just something I remembered from a previous study. So sometimes you'll remember other things, and that's okay to include. But yeah, try not to use other resources yet.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay. And if you give in to the temptation, just make sure to write down the
Repent.
reference. Give credit. All right.
And repentance.
And repent. Is that what you said? Okay. Any other questions? Let's see.
But in this time, Pastor Tim, is because in chapter 5, he writes about adultery. So this time, Solomon does not commit adultery, or he commit already adultery at this time, or he
Oh,
learned from his father or his mother or from her mother.
what's your are you
That
Proverbs
because
5?
no, Proverbs 3.
Oh, 3.
But I read in Proverbs 5 about warning his son.
Yeah. Well, I tend to think most of the Proverbs were written earlier in his reign, because it says in 1 Kings 11 that when Solomon was old, his wives turned him away from the Lord to false gods. So I tend to doubt he's going to write inspired scripture when he is not worshiping the Lord, but worshiping idols. Okay. So I believe that's likely these Proverbs are written, earlier in his reign, when his sons are young. By the way, too, when they're still in his home, so to speak. So it's likely, yeah, Proverbs 3, Proverbs 5 was before he went astray. We don't know for sure. That's my opinion. That's my guess from knowing his life. And like I said, 1 Kings 11, I think verse 1 tells us when he was old that
Probably
went astray.
during 20 wives and 400 concubines.
Yeah, that's
Period.
that's a problem. Okay, Narelle asks a question here. Let me address that. He says, related to the last assignment, do we do the same breaking the whole chapter with our passage assigned? Like, yeah. So if you've already done the stanzas from last week, when you summarized each chapter, then you've already done a good part of your assignment for this week. Okay. But I still like you to write down, the stanzas. And when you guys do that, follow, like I said, the format that I show you here on this assignment, where you go through these steps. I want you to put down the translations, what each of them have. Then I want you to identify if you see any structural markers, and then look for other things that may indicate. So don't just put the stanzas that you came up with. I want you to go through this process as you do that, okay? Because that's what you're going to do every time, for whether it's a psalm, whether it's these wisdom poems, and sometimes you're going to be in other books that use poetry, right? All the prophets use poetry for much of their prophecies. All the wisdom literature that we encounter, Ecclesiastes and Job, Song of Solomon, those two will be extended poems or extended poetic expressions that you're going to need to be able to look for things that show you each of the units of thought. That's what a stanza is, right? It's a unit of thought. It's like a paragraph in poetry that's focused on one thought, one idea, and then connected together to the other stanzas to form an overall flow of thought. All right, any other questions on your passage in relation to this assignment? Jess, did you have one?
Yeah, Pastor Tim. This is a question that lingered in my mind for quite some time. Pastor Tim, what is the difference between polygamy and adultery in the Old Testament? Uh,
What's your passage?
No, no, it's not connected to my passage. My passage is
Oh,
Proverbs 2.
you're sneaking a question in.
Yeah, yeah. It just crossed to my mind when I read Proverbs. Solomon had been warning his son against this adulterous women, and uh, when in fact he had so many women in his life.
Well, again, we don't know specifically when all of these proverbs were written. I mean, if you look at early on, okay, if we go back to First Kings, right, that gives us the historical background, right? And it's in First Kings, Solomon becomes king in, let's see, is it chapter 2? Solomon becomes king, right? And then chapter 3 is when God offers Solomon, he offers him basically anything he wants. And so Solomon, right, asks for wisdom. Okay. And then chapter 4, it says that's when it describes his rule and his reign, how he gains much wealth. All right. And then chapter 4 is where it tells us he spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. Chapter 4, verse 32. All right. So if I should probably just. Okay. So notice there, I've opened up the passage just as First Kings chapter 4. So it's in chapter 4 that it seems as if he's already written a number of proverbs and songs. Okay. This is earlier in his reign. Chapter 5, his alliance with Hiram. And then the building projects are described. Chapter 6 is the temple. Again, he's walking with the Lord here, right? And the temple's built. And then it's that, wonderful prayer that he offers in chapter 6. Then it's in chapter 7. It describes the building of his palace. Let's see. I'm trying to find, was it chapter 8? Okay, the ark's brought to the temple. Solomon addresses the people. There's this prayer. Trying to find. Okay, he's walking with the Lord up to
He
chapter
went
9. Yeah, 11 is when he goes astray, but I'm trying to find. Here's the Queen of Sheba, chapter 10. Okay, and then we hit chapter 11. Now, to this point, all that's been mentioned is give me a second to find. Wow, that's mentioned a lot. Yeah, here we go. Chapter 3, verse 1. So again, early in Solomon's reign is when he becomes married to the Pharaoh's daughter, right? That's the only reference to a wife up till chapter 11. Okay? So when we get to chapter 11, so far up before chapter 11, everything is great. Chapter 2, he becomes king. Chapter 3, he gets married. Then the Lord offers him, he asks for wisdom. Chapter 4, 5, he's establishing his reign, his wealth. He's displaying his wisdom. Chapter 6, builds a temple. Chapter 8, dedicate the temple. But then we get to chapter 11. And it just says, now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now, it doesn't give us a time indication there. It doesn't say right after chapter 10 this happened. It just says he loved many foreign women, and then it says how many, right? 700 wives. But when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart against So it's hard to determine exactly when this happened. Was he accumulating wives all the time, or did this happen later in his reign? And I would say, one observation is we don't see any mention of other wives up until chapter 11.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
the idea of adultery in the book of Proverbs, it might be that Solomon learned the consequences of King David, the people of King David, of his adultery.
Certainly, yeah. His mother, I'm sure he found out firsthand from his mother, right? The consequences. He had a brother, right, who died. Solomon had an older brother that died. Remember the baby from Bathsheba and David?
Yes.
That was Solomon's older brother. But he did not live. He was born and then he died as an infant. So yeah, there is some history there. And again, Solomon was given wisdom by God, so he would know, these consequences, even if he did not have any experience in his own life or his father's life. But yeah, certainly he saw what happened, or some of which he saw what happened to his father, right? His half brother tried to take the throne. Another half brother raped one of his half sisters. I mean, so Solomon probably observed firsthand some of this.
Pastor Tim, another idea is, can we include the architectural of our the cultural context? Can we include the architectural as what Solomon did in the
Oh,
during
sure.
his reign?
Yeah, if you want to put in some of the thing, yeah, he had a lot of construction projects. So if you want to identify that, that's perfectly fine. Is that what you were saying? The architectural?
Yes.
Yeah, he was known for that. And that actually is an important detail that comes up later in the reign of his son Rehoboam, right? Because remember, when his son Rehoboam took the throne, the people came and said, your dad made us work hard. Can you just, take it easy on us and don't make us work so hard like your dad did? And then Rehoboam says, no way, I'm going to make you work harder. And that ended his popularity. But yeah, if you want to mention the construction projects as one of the things that Solomon was known for, that'd be fine. Yeah, his achievements. Yeah.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
I have a question in this First Kings chapter 3.
Yeah.
Verse 1, now King Solomon loved many foreign women, which is
Well, that's
Israelites
verse,
not allowed
that's verse 11,
to
right?
verse
Chapter
1 verse 3 chapter 3
Oh, chapter 3.
form a marriage. Now Solomon form a marriage alliance with Pharaoh king of Egypt
Yeah.
to Pharaoh's daughter, because I am in First King reading on my every night. Then it pop up in my mind that Israel is not allowed to intermarry with other nation in the law of Moses, or in the time of Israel. That, but at the same time, he married an Egypt and daughter of Egypt. And verse 3, now Solomon loved the Lord.
So what passage are you referring to that they're
Chapter
not allowed?
3.
No, I know that.
How?
What passage says that they can't marry foreign women?
To the narrative of Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, to the narrative of Numbers, where Balaam, Phinehas.
Yeah, that was a particular situation, but remember, there are a lot of Joseph married the daughter of the priest of Pharaoh.
Mm.
Abraham married someone who was not of his culture. So it happened quite a bit from what I remember. Moses, right? He didn't marry an Israelite. He married a Midianite.
Yes.
So there were some
Okay.
restriction by God, I think, on like the Moabite, or was it the Moabites? I can't remember.
Yeah, Moabites.
If they was restricted from marriage. Now later, the problem with Phineas was, if you remember, at that time they were restricted from. Let's see, where was that in Exodus? Or was that was in Numbers actually, right?
Numbers.
Okay. Oops. Didn't spell it right. Okay. Yeah,
Exodus. Oh.
yeah, he brought a Midianite woman. The problem was that in that specific context, right, they had joined themselves with the daughters of Moab, and those women, that culture, led them to worship the false gods of the Moabites. So I don't know if the issue was they married foreign women, but that they followed in the worship of false gods with those women.
Yeah, I know.
And then sort of, so I'd have to kind of review. There were times there were some restrictions, but I don't know that that was a requirement that Solomon could not
Yes.
marry one foreign wife. But see, the problem is he married many wives, just like the men of Israel in Numbers 25 here, where they married Moabite women and then began to worship the gods of the Moabites. And that was the problem. So that's a good question. But, I think, like I said, of Joseph, he married an Egyptian woman as well. Abraham married. Well, but of course, there was no people of Israel at the time of Abraham. But he married Keturah, I think, after Sarah died, right? And she was a foreigner. So I know that doesn't answer your question fully, but
Pastor Tim,
things to think about. Yeah, Jess.
the prohibition for the Israelites not to marry a foreigner is not a general rule. It's just an occasional prohibition.
That's what's coming to my mind, but I could be wrong. I haven't studied that in a while, so I'm not remembering everything about that, but I think that's the case, because like I said, Moses, again, he married a Midianite woman. He didn't marry an Israelite. Neither did
Because certain Exodus 34:11 to 16.
Exodus
Moses said to Israel,
34:11.
Yeah, 16. And you might take some of his daughters, of your sons, his daughters.
Yeah, and the focus there was idolatry. And so and again, the concern here, I don't know that the concern was the marriage as much as the influence to false to the worship of false gods, which is exactly what happened in the case of Solomon. It's exactly what happened in the case of the Israelites with the Moabites.
But it wakes up that question to me because in chapter 2, David, in First King 2, David instructs Solomon to follow God with all his heart.
Yeah. And
even though that's not mentioned these things. That's why.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think there was a prohibition there, because in chapter 3, as you noticed, it says right that right after the statement of his formed a marriage alliance, it says Solomon loved the Lord, and I think this is the only time that I think in the Old Testament that this statement is made, where it says a man loved the Lord. You can look that up. Okay. There are many commands to love the Lord, as we see in these cross references, but I don't know that there is a passage where it says a specific person loved Yahweh. So I would find it rather odd that right after it's describing this marriage that it says Solomon loved Yahweh, because if this was forbidden, then that would be a strange place to put it right after it.
Yes.
Say he walked in the statutes of. So
Yes, that's where my question, because after few verses, verse after in verse 3, now Solomon loved the Lord.
yeah.
That's why it popped up in my mind this question. If there's it's not the story in Numbers, Deuteronomy that Moses
Yeah, well,
forbidden.
Nehemiah as well, right? And
Yeah,
Ezra,
Nehemiah.
that's much later. That's in the 400s. But in Nehemiah or in Ezra, they had more than one wife. So that was the issue there. And so there was a problem with that. So the Bible's very clear. I think Jess asked about polygamy. You know, the Bible's very clear right from the beginning in Genesis 3. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. You know, and then you can't have a man and more than one wife becoming one flesh. It's one man and one woman. So yes, many of the Israelite kings had more than one wife. Many of the patriarchs did. That doesn't mean that was right. Certainly in the culture, there were some things that were more accepted, like slavery, for example. Slavery was not right either, but the Lord recognized that there would still be those who would practice slavery. And so he put laws into place to regulate how slaves were treated. But yeah, polygamy is still wrong.
Maybe Pastor Tim, the provision here, there's no provision to marry other nation women, but not to worship their gods.
That's the concern.
Because if in the story of Ruth is a Moabites, and and God told them not to marry a Moab, but Ruth and Boaz get married because Ruth is the issue of Ruth is he wants to in chapter 1 she wants the God of Naomi is God also.
Yeah, she becomes a God follower of Yahweh, and so
her identity is because of worshiping Yahweh.
Yeah,
it's not Moabite.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, some good broader questions. Are there anybody have any specific questions on their passage in relation to this assignment?
So Tim, regarding the Proverbs, how do we identify the theological theme?
I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry. Say that again.
how can we identify the theological theme of the passage or of Proverbs?
Well, it's just the background theology of the culture at that time. You know, do they, you know, it's the audience is the Israelites, so we know they were theistic, monotheistic,
Okay.
that kind of thing. If you had a, you know, theological, you know, the theological context is just what was the belief system of those who are referenced in the book. So, like for example, if you're studying Jonah, you would be talking also about the Ninevites. What was their theological context? But here in Proverbs, it's just Solomon and the people of Israel. So that's all we're looking at. But like if you're studying Galatians, then you would also want to identify.
I thought the theological, the theological issues that we find in the passage. Okay, that's what I thought before.
No, it's the context, background
Thank you,
context.
Thank you, Mr. Tim.
Sure. No problem. Okay. Any other questions?
In chapter 3, Pastor Timba, in my passage in Proverbs 3,
Yeah.
there's only 3 passage in using Nasby, but my passage starts in verse 19 to 26.
Okay.
So divide. You're the one who divide this passage, positive. So we will, based on Nasby translation, my passage does not depend in the Nasby translation.
Right. That's why you need to look at other translations for one. So the ESV breaks it up there. See that?
Yes, in ESV.
ESV breaks up that stanza, and the New King James breaks it up at 19 and 20, then 21 to 26. Okay, so just that's why I want you to look at the different translations, because you'll see some patterns, and then you need to just look on your own and ask, okay, what seems to be some divisions, because here he's talking about happy is the man who finds wisdom and all the fruit of that, but then he changes focus. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. Now it's still talking about wisdom. There's a shift. And then notice my son. So there's now a direct address in verse 21. So I think those are some features that will show you some breaks in the stanzas. Okay. Yeah, the New American Standard tends to, for the Proverbs, have large stanzas. So I don't think they have done a good job of that in the Proverbs, the New American Standard.
Okay, thank you, Pastor Tim.
Sure, no problem. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, assignment 2. Do your best, work on this. And like I said, if you're having trouble finishing assignment 1, just we've talked about some of the background context here. But there's also a lot of information in the notes in the teacher's manual. So really try to get to work and get that done so you can get caught up, okay? If you're
okay, Pastor Tim.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you much.
Let me ask maybe Kenneth Kabanda, are you still there? Would you close us in prayer if you are?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Thanks. Thank you. And then
Let's pray. Father God, we bless and honor your name for once again giving us the grace to learn, Lord, this specific assignment, Lord, not only